Hello. Oh my God. This is so crazy. So, hello and welcome or welcome back to my channel. So, I have talked a little bit about plot breakdowns and how I enjoy them. Specifically, Carrie can read's plot breakdowns on ACOTAR, the A Court of Thorns and Roses series by Sarah J. Maas. That was like my introduction to plot breakdowns, but there's so many of them out there on YouTube. There are like Pretty Little Liars and like Degrassi, and I saw one once about Frankenstein. So a lot of people are doing these. I didn't think I could do one, nor was I interested in doing one, but I've been taking a Jane Austen class. I've said that literally everywhere. It's on my Instagram bio. I've said it like 3 times now in all my reading wrap-up videos. So yeah, I'm taking a Jane Austen class. It's very interesting. And the plots of the books are so, like, there's a lot happening. They're certainly not just romance. And because I'm taking this class, it's a lot of books, like Jane Austen books back to back to back. I kind of felt like I needed like a refresher. This class is almost done. I actually have a research paper due that I should be doing instead of doing this, but whatever, it'll get done. So it's just a lot of information, and I'm having to read articles and do discussion posts, and like it's just a lot. And I'm enjoying the books, but like I'm going back through, I'm doing Sense and Sensibility today, as you can see, hopefully. So going back and basically rereading Sense and Sensibility, I'm appreciating it more. Hopefully, I plan to do this for the other Jane Austen novels. It'll take me a while. This is just part 1, because Jane Austen's books are broken up volume 1, 2, 3, typically. I think that's how they all have been so far. We're just gonna bang this one out. Should be, I wonder how long it'll take. Also, yeah, that's also another reason why I'm doing this like in parts, because I don't know how long it'll be. So shall we proceed and get into Sense and Sensibility? So in the timeline of Jane Austen novels, I should know this. Okay, so Sense and Sensibility is, I believe, her first published work. You can kind of tell if you actually decide to read the book, which I suggest that you do. This is not a replacement for reading the book. This is just, I thought that it's fun for me. Like I said, I'm going through the books again pretty much, but also like I thought it would be helpful because, you know, if you're taking like an English class and you have to read a Jane Austen book, maybe you can get like a good refresher, like a summary, like if you have a test or like an essay to do. But this is not a replacer at all. If you choose to read the book, you can kind of tell, not in the quality that it's her first book, or not even her first book, but like her first published work, but there's certainly like, I don't know, you can kind of see the beginnings of any author when you read their first work. And like the more that they write, obviously they like get their footing, they establish their footing. But regardless of whatever I just said, I really enjoyed this book. Oh, what I'm also going to say, and it'll come up later, but this also is evident that it's her first published work because it's not that it reads older, but some of the characters are like some of the older characters over where here, they are kind of like holdovers of like the 18th century, and you know, we're getting into the early 19th century Regency era here, so there's kind of like you can see kind of like the difference between some of the generations. Volume 1, Chapter 1 is basically like a breakdown of the family tree. So in my my professor, she was like, a lot of people had questions about the like family tree and the connections of all the characters, because there's like Marion Dashwood and Mrs. Dashwood and Mrs. John Dashwood and Henry Dashwood and Harry Dashwood. Like, it's a lot, you know? And once you actually get to like know the characters and like understand the family, it does make sense. It's slightly confusing at first, and I've noticed it's kind of like that with pretty much all of Jane Austen's novels, because, you know, these characters, these people, they live in the English countryside. They're very tight-knit most of the time. A lot of the times they're related, like cousins, there's brothers, there's, you know, there's like a mom, like Mrs. Dashwood, but then somebody will get married and then like there's another Mrs. Dashwood. This book is basically centered on the Dashwood family. We have the patriarch, who's Henry Dashwood, the mother, Mrs. Dashwood. We have the Dashwood siblings. I hope I'm not like too far off, like in the corner. Like, if I don't watch myself properly, the whole video will just be me doing this. We have this family. This book is mainly centered on the Dashwood family. They are the center of our world. The Dashwoods have lived in Sussex on a large estate. They are indeed a part of the gentry. Like, what happens later on in the novel and just like their general situation, I guess there's like a confusion of what their status is, and you see that a lot, I guess, like even with like Pride and Prejudice, there's this confusion that like the Bennets are poor or something. No in that case, and no in this case, the Dashwoods are in fact a part of the gentry. Their situation, especially as women, they kind of fall from grace, so to speak. But no, they are in fact wealthy. So they have lived in Sussex at Norland Park and are generally well liked in the neighborhood. They're a nice family, no complaints. It's all good in the neighborhood. So, okay, the previous owner of Norland Park old single man, which is basically what he was. He was the uncle to Henry Dashwood. The old single man, he was primarily being taken care of by his sister. He had invited his sister to come and live with him to take care of him. But when she passed away, this man invited Henry and his family. So Mrs. Dashwood, Eleanor, Marion, and then Margaret. I should have probably put Eleanor in the middle. Should I move her? We'll move her. I'll move her because she's arguably like the main character. Let's move her. Alright. So he invites Henry, his wife, the oldest child, middle child, youngest child. Oh, also John. Can't forget John. We're gonna get this. Okay, so the three girls, the three Dashwood sisters, they are Henry's girls with Mrs. Dashwood. John is his child from a previous marriage. Okay, so the old single man, he obviously has no heirs to pass on his estate to. I am no Regency era expert, but basically the like estates, like the old country estates, they were passed down through the oldest son. So because I'm using my finger. So because the old man had no heirs to inherit the estate, I guess it would go to the next oldest male man, whatever. So that would be Henry. So basically, when the old man passes away, which happens, he dies, the estate goes to Henry, but in his will, the old single man, he had like a term where the estate would pass from son to son's son to the son's son. So that would be, we'll move him over, John. So basically the terms of the old man's will are that he can only leave. So John gets the estate. This is all in chapter 1. By the way, this is all in chapter 1. All this information is given to you in chapter 1. So When the old man dies, John gets the estate. The girls, the women, the Dashwood women, well, actually, no, just most of the girls, only the girls, I believe. Yes, they're only set to be given like £10,000. So John's mother, I forget exactly what the reason is, but John Dashwood's mother, Henry's former wife, had like a lot of money. So she died. So John, got those assets, as well as from his wife, who was also very wealthy, Mrs. John Dashwood, Fanny Ferrars. I don't really know how to pronounce that last name, so that's my bad. Through marrying Fanny, he's even wealthier. So really, yeah, we'll talk about it a little bit more, but John is very wealthy. In chapter 1, we are informed that Henry, on his deathbed, Henry dies also. I should probably take him off. But on his deathbed, he asked for his son, John, to take care of his sisters and his mother, his stepmother, but I don't think they really use that term. I think she's just his mother. But yeah, he makes him promise that he will take care of them. Henry dies, and John has made his promise to take care of his family and decides that £3,000 for the girls is good enough. But what happens? So John's wife, Mrs. John Dashwood, Fanny, she's a character. If this was a different time period, we'd be throwing down. We'd be throwing hands. She's a problem. Like, okay, so as soon as Henry dies, Mrs. Dashwood's husband, the patriarch of the Dashwood family, the father, immediately once he dies, John is the owner of Norland Park, and that makes Fanny immediately like the new mistress. Time to leave. I'm moving in. Mrs. Dashwood, she does want to leave. Mrs. Dashwood does not like Fanny at all. She does not like her. But I'm on her side because Fanny is truly terrible. Even though Mrs. Dashwood just wants to like get up and leave, Eleanor, who is our wisest character, she's only 19 years old, but she's very calm and cool and collected, and I suppose because of common courtesy, Eleanor's like, no, we should stay and not immediately leave. Like, Mrs. Dashwood wants to leave immediately. It is rude that Fanny's like, I'm moving in, I'm the new mistress. But Eleanor says no, because it would be rude, I guess, to just like up and leave. So they do stay a little bit while, I don't know how long, maybe like a couple months, probably, a couple weeks, maybe a month, I don't know, that they're there once Fanny moves in. Chapter 2, John and Fanny are officially the new owners of Norland Park. They are the official residents of that estate, and the Dashwood women are essentially like visitors in their, like, especially the girls. It's basically like the girls' childhood home. And now they're like visitors. I would hate that. That is one of the things that, like, the right to own like a home, an estate back in the day, like, especially again for women, like, they had no rights. They had no rights to it at all, even though this was the home that they grew up in. They're now immediately like, it's just not their home. They are given the freedom to stay there. They also need to find a place to live, so they kind of have to stay there as they're thinking of where they're going to move next. Chapter 2 is where we're able to see how devious Fanny is, and also just how John is not, he's kind of horrible. He's sort of like, who's like the actual villain? There's like a couple of villains of this novel. I don't know if I would say John is like a full-on villain, but he's just not like very bright. Like, he's not very, I don't know, he's just not that smart. And he's really easily led by his wife, but not in like a oh, you're whipped kind of thing. He's just like not smart. Fanny's very devious, and just, I don't know, she easily leads him. She talks him into basically giving the girls even less money than he was considering giving them. As I said, John made a promise to his dying father that he would take care of his family, of the girls and Mrs. Dashwood. So John has decided that he's going to give the girls £3,000 each to the Dashwood sisters. And Fanny is not happy about this because she sees that as money being taken away from her son in the future. In chapter 2, like the first page, Mrs. John Dashwood, Fanny, did not at all approve of what her husband intended to do for his sisters. To take £3,000 from the fortune of their dear little boy would be, dear little boy is Harry, who I have as Chip from Beauty and the Beast. To take £3,000 from the fortune of their dear little boy would be impoverishing him to the most dreadful degree. She begged him to think again on the subject. How could he answer it to himself to rob his child, and his only child too, of so large a sum? And what possible claim could the Miss Dashwoods, who were related to him only by half-blood, they're half-siblings, as I said. I hope I'm doing okay with this so far. I hope I'm not being too confusing, but yes, they're half siblings. He has a different mommy. So basically, Fanny does not consider, because they're half siblings, them to really have much of a relationship, and therefore his generosity is too large an amount. Like, it's not worth it for half siblings, I guess, to be nice and courteous to them and make sure that they have a place to live and food in their stomachs, I guess. So it says here, I'm not entirely sure about this. Obviously, this is from a narrator written by an author who lived in this time. But this sentence says, it was very well known that no affection was ever supposed to exist between the children of any man by different marriages. I don't know if that's true. I suppose so, because it says it here. But I guess because they're half siblings, it's causing an issue. Like, it doesn't make, like, it could just be, I mean, this is from, a lot of Jane Austen's novels are, like, there's typically a central character that we see the events through their perspective, but you're still getting thoughts and feelings from other characters. So sometimes they might think something that might not necessarily be like what the narrator believes and thinks. So this is Fanny's sort of internal thoughts, kind of, but not really. But the narrator is basically telling us that Fanny doesn't think, like, because they're half siblings, she doesn't think that John should be super, like, she shouldn't cater to them, basically, and be helpful. I don't know if really that's how people thought back then, or if this is just Fanny, but that's what she thinks. Fanny does not want John to help them as much, and John's like, but I promised my dying father. I have him down here. This is like a real man, by the way. When I looked up Henry Dashwood, this man came up. He's like the second Dashwood of something, I don't know, but anyway, he's like, I promised my dying father that I would help them. So, and Fanny basically says, so to John, saying that he said he promised his dying father that he would help his family, she basically says that Henry, the father, was not mentally sound enough to like make such oaths and like promises. I guess he wasn't mentally sound enough to make requests that his like wife and children be taken care of. Okay, so yeah, you can see the kind of person that Fanny is just from chapter 2. So yeah, but there is a discussion in chapter 2 of like exactly what to give to the girls and blah blah blah. I will be honest, I'm really bad at math. And when numbers and things like that just come up, my eyes glaze over. It goes in one ear, out the other. Although I was reading this with my eyes, so it went into my eyes and in my brain and just didn't process. So you can read it chapter 2. It's not very long. These chapters, Jane Austen's chapters, are typically short. They do discuss like the amounts that should be given to the girls. I'm not entirely sure what is considered well off and what's not. I know that like originally the girls were supposed to get 10,000 pounds, and I thought that wasn't a lot. I think it's still not really a lot, but it would have, I guess, been enough for them to be comfortable. Here's what I understand. This is what I wrote in my notes. So the Dashwood sisters already had 1,000 pounds apiece from their grandfather, and John's plan was to give them another 1,000. What ultimately ends up happening is Fanny is able to convince John to lower the sum of the Dashwood's income to basically nothing. He does consider giving them at least like furniture and stuff for their new home. By chapter 2, I don't believe by chapter 2, they have not found a new home yet, but they will be leaving at some point. And so John is like, we could give them furniture, china, linen. And Fanny, in response to John considering giving the Dashwood women, like furniture and stuff, Fanny says, that is a material consideration, undoubtedly, a valuable legacy indeed, and yet some of the plate would have been a very pleasant addition to our own stock here. So basically she's like, but I want the china. John's like, we could give them china. She's like, no, but I want it. Ultimately, by the end of chapter 2, it is decided that John is giving his sisters and his mother nothing. Basically nothing. Except just general kindness that you would give to a regular old neighbor. So, chapter 3. The Dashwood women, Mrs. Dashwood, Eleanor, Marian, and Margaret. I'm calling them women. Margaret is a little girl, but it's weird to like say Dashwood girls, and then we have her, and then Dashwood women, we have her. I don't know. I'm going to be using girls and women interchangeably, sometimes just the Dashwoods. I don't know. I'm sorry. Okay. Anyway, so they live at Norland Park for several months. I don't know exactly how many months, but several, probably at least 3. And like I said, Mrs. Dashwood really, really hates Fanny. Mrs. Dashwood wants to leave though, but they can't because over here you can barely see. I got these printed at the library. Some of the pictures came out a little darker than I wanted to, but I'll put it up on here somewhere. But Edward Ferrars. Edward is Fanny's brother. He's the eldest Ferrars sibling, and he comes to visit Norland Park, and he is the reason why Mrs. Dashwood can't up and leave. And why is that? Because the two of them are getting cozy with one another. This is kind of an important theme of the book, but I will read Edward's description for you. But essentially, he's not your typical Austen heroine. Hero, what we're used to as like the guy, the handsome man, strolling down a field with his chest bared and like cape flowing in the breeze, or a man coming out of the lake with his white shirt plastered to his body. Edward is nothing like that. I will read his description. Edward Ferrars was not recommended to their good opinion by any peculiar graces of person or address. He was not handsome, and his manners required intimacy to make them pleasing. He was too diffident to do justice to himself, but when his natural shyness was overcome, his behavior gave every indication of an open, affectionate heart. He's just not particularly handsome. He's kind of awkward. I've now seen Sense and Sensibility, the 1995 movie version, and I've seen the BBC one. And Hugh Grant, I get it. Hugh Grant, like, when I see him a lot of the times, he's Hugh Grant, but I love him. Well, he's kind of like a jerk, I've heard, but I like him in movies. But anyway, I think Hugh Grant is good at, like, the awkward, and so I think he does play Edward well in the movie. So does Dan Stevens. I do prefer Dan Stevens' portrayal just because, as you can see, like, I have pictures from different like adaptations, kind of like it's like a hodgepodge. I do like his version, Dan's, the most. He does bring, actually, I think that Hugh Grant was a little more awkward, which is how Edward's kind of supposed to be. Dan makes Edward a little more charming. As the narration and as Edward's description says, once Edward opens up, he is warm and affectionate and a nice guy, and Eleanor appreciates that quite a bit. Edward is also, like I said, he's the oldest Ferrars sibling. His father died very rich. His mother is still alive, Mrs. Ferrars. Anyway, his mother is still alive and she controls the assets. Edward, being the eldest son, he is due to inherit the wealth, I guess determined by her. Again, I'm not a Regency era expert. It depends. I think I've heard or read somewhere that widows, if it was written in the will, like certain loopholes, they could end up having like more, like the reason why Mrs. Ferrars is in control of the assets, like as opposed to Mrs. Dashwood, because I mean, she wasn't married to the old guy. She was the wife of somebody who was the heir to Norland Park, so she wasn't like in a will of any loopholes. Like she's not a widow of that guy. I don't know. It's kind of confusing for me too, but just basically just know that she controls the wealth of her dead husband. I'm not entirely sure why, because you would think that they know their son and brother, but Fanny and Mrs. Ferrars, they have high hopes for Edward to become like this big shot in like the government and politics, whatever. But Edward just wants to like be a clergyman. He wants to live a more humble lifestyle. He's a humble guy, but for some reason they think that he'll be like this big thing. I don't know where that comes from. Don't know. Along with that and their huge dreams for him, they would also like for him to marry a wealthy woman. And the person that he's getting cozy with is not that. Meanwhile, Mrs. Dashwood is like, so yeah, Mrs. Dashwood is all for this relationship. She is not. Oh, another person who's not particularly happy about this is her. Marianne Dashwood, the middle child of the Dashwood sisters, and she was destined to be a theater kid. Destined. She is so dramatic. You'll see. But yeah, so she's not happy about it because she thinks that Edward is like, meh. She doesn't get it. So this is what Marianne says about Edward. So there is something wanting. His figure is not striking. It has none of that grace which I should expect in the man who could seriously attach my sister. His eyes want all that spirit, that fire, which at once announce virtue and intelligence. And besides all this, I am afraid, mamma, he has no real taste. Music seems scarcely to attract him, and though he admires Eleanor's drawings very much, it is not the admiration of a person who can understand their worth. It is evident, in spite of his frequent attention to her while she draws, that in fact he knows nothing of the matter. He admires as a lover, not as a connoisseur. To satisfy me, those characters must be united. I cannot be happy with a man whose taste did not in every point coincide with my own. He must enter into all my feelings. The same books, the same music must charm us both. Oh, Mama, how spiritless, how tame was Edward's manner in reading to us last night. I felt for my sister most severely. Yet she bore with it so much composure. She seemed scarcely to notice it. I could hardly keep my seat. To hear those beautiful lines, which have frequently almost driven me wild, pronounced with such impenetrable calmness, such dreadful indifference. Edward, back in the day, They didn't have TV and stuff, so they would sit around and listen to music being played, like a piano. They would read books to each other out loud. Edward read like a passage from Cowper or something, she said, I think, out loud, and Marian was not impressed. So, and she's just not particularly happy with this pair up, this matchup. What you have to know about Marian is from her description in chapter 1. So this is what it says. She was sensible and clever, but eager in everything. Her sorrows, her joys could have no moderation, and no truer words have been spoken. Marian loves... Oh my God, that's me. I was reading after the quote, I was reading my words, like it was what Jane Austen wrote. Yeah, so her sorrows, her joys could have no moderation. And I said, and no true words have been spoken. Marian loves drama. And like I said, if she lived today, she would be a theater kid. She loves drama. Chapter 4, Eleanor and Marian are just lounging around somewhere on Norland Park's grounds, whatever. And Marian's talking to Eleanor about Edward and is basically alluding to the fact that they seem to be like an item. And Eleanor is like, huh? Like, she's talking about like marriage and stuff. Like, she's talking about calling Edward a brother and stuff. And Eleanor is like, what are you talking about? Eleanor does like Edward quite a lot, but she doesn't really know if he feels the same, like in the way, like if she, you know, he's like a good companion and she is attracted to him, obviously, but she's just like not sure if the feeling is mutual. There seems to be something about him that just seems a little closed off, and I wrote it down, but I'm not gonna go through that quote. It's described as like a want of spirit, like he just doesn't seem fully into whatever it is between the two of them. At this point, even though she does like him, she thinks it's really just a friendship that they have. Whatever it is that's going on between them, Fanny doesn't like it, but poo-poo, who cares? Not Mrs. Dashwood. Mrs. Dashwood is finding Fanny more and more insufferable. And eventually, Mrs. Dashwood receives a letter from Sir John Middleton for a cottage on his grounds. What is it? On the outskirts of Barton Park, which is his estate. So there's a cottage in that area, and he offers the Dashwood girls that cottage for a low rent, not low rent, like a reasonable rent. I don't know how much the rent is, but reasonable. Chapter 5, Mrs. Dashwood she had gotten the letter in chapter 4, but she sends her letter that she accepts, and she goes to Fanny and John, and she's like, we out this bitch. John is like, oh, I hope it's not like too far away. Oh my gosh. They're moving to Devonshire. The Dashwood women are moving to Devonshire. However far it is apparently far enough that Edward is not happy about these women, particularly her, going that far away. I love Mrs. Dashwood because she extends an invitation to Edward. I think she does also extend an invitation to them to like visit them at the cottage, but hers is much nicer to Edward. She's just basically like, fuck you and fuck you too, to John and Fanny. But Edward is invited to the cottage anytime. So for this new cottage, they had to significantly, the Dashwood women, cut down on the things that, not just things, but also like the help that they would have. You know, like a really wealthy person in this time period, like really, really wealthy, like Darcy, for example, in Pride and Prejudice, would have multiple servants. The Dashwood women will have one maid and one manservant. The manservant and the maid are sent to the cottage to prepare it for their arrival. They say their goodbyes, and Marian is dramatic as usual, but in this case I kind of understand it because she's leaving her childhood home. So chapter 6, the journey from Norland Park to Barton Park. I feel like I should have put pictures of the houses, but I don't even know where I would have been able to fit that. But whatever. From Norland Park to Barton Park, it's not a happy trip, obviously. They are not happy to be leaving, but once they get to Barton Valley, their spirits lift, at least from the movie. Obviously, this is a fictional place, but the landscape for the movie was beautiful. And so I could totally see myself being, well, in general, I would be fine in that cottage, but you know, for them, it's a major downgrade. I would be fine. I'd be perfectly happy. I actually like the movie depiction of the movie. Yes, I like the movie depiction of the cottage better. The BBC one, I didn't love it. It just looks really gray. But Barton Valley is very nice, lush greenness everywhere. But when the women get to the cottage, it is not up to their liking, obviously. Again, for me, I would be fine with it, but they're coming from a huge country estate, a very large, beautiful, luxurious house, and the cottage is just a little shabby. Even though it's not quite up to their standards, they're not like super negative about it. Mrs. Dashwood is determined to make it a home. She's excited to add new furniture. With what money? Hopeful thinking. It's not what they want it to be yet. But also, I forgot to warn anybody, there's a pimple patch on my face. Just FYI, that's what that is, in case you see that. Because I was expecting to be like this the whole entire time, but I have been walking. I said it was Sir John Middleton. He owns Barton Park in Barton Valley, and the cottage that they're living in is on the outskirts of Barton Park. Is that what I just said? Yes, it was Barton Park. So he is the one that offered them the cottage, and what else he offered them? I'm getting tired now. He offered them the cottage. He is their cousin, or like Mrs. Dashwood's cousin. I don't know what manner of cousin he is. It's obviously not first cousin. He's some form of a cousin to the Dashwoods, and they're like distant family. They're relatives. But he visits the cottage the day after their arrival. So John Middleton, he's 40. He's supposed to be 40 and quite handsome. Now, I'm not saying that this man who played Mr. Weasley, I forget his name right now, but I'm not saying he's not handsome or anything, but I am saying that the portrayal of John Middleton, Sir Middleton, in the movie, he was far older than he was supposed to be. He's supposed to be 40, and the man in the movie was like 50s at least. And then he, I think, was also in his 50s when he played this role. I don't really know how I'm supposed to picture John Middleton when I read, because the way he's depicted so far in like visual like adaptations, it's not quite what the description is. But he's supposed to be 40. He's not particularly old, and he's supposed to be handsome. And I think that he's just generally like, he's relatively young. He's not super old. Even for this time period, I don't think he's not like an old man. He's like middle-aged, I guess, for that time. Now, 40 I consider still quite young. And he's very nice. He's a little bit meddlesome, can be kind of obnoxious, especially if you're like an introvert, but he's nice. He's a nice man. He offered the Dashwood women a place to stay when they really needed it, and didn't like swindle them or anything or play tricks on them. Like, he gave them like a reasonable rent. I think that John is portrayed as being I think he's portrayed as being the way that he is because he's like a cousin that we don't really know what cousin he is, like second, third, fourth, fifth. But, compared to John, who is literally, he's her stepson and he's their sibling, and he treats them horribly. But this man who, like, this random cousin treats them so well, I think it's supposed to be, I think it's supposed to make him look even worse than he already looks. But he talks a lot and likes to be around people. Couldn't be me. Not like I don't like being around people. I do, but I have my limit. I am, in fact, a hardcore introvert. So Sir John Middleton offers the women like a few things, like help and stuff. He offers to, when they have letters, to take the letters to and from the post for them. He brings them a letter from his wife, Lady Middleton. In the letter, she requests to meet the Dashwood family, and it's the next day, I believe. So the day after the day, whatever, I don't know. They meet Lady Middleton at the cottage. Yes, she brings her butt down to the cottage to meet the Dashwood family. Lady Middleton is significantly younger than Sir John. He's about 40. She's about 26, 27. She's supposed to be very pretty, but she's so different from her husband. He is so outgoing. This man is so outgoing. And her description is kind of like she's cold. She's a little cold, a little aloof. The only thing this woman cares about is her children. If you talk to her children, make a big deal about her children, she will be your best friend. Other than that, outside of that, nothing. By the end of Lady Middleton's trip to the cottage, the Dashwood women are invited to Barton Park. Chapter 7. The Dashwood women travel about half a mile to Barton Park from the cottage. The Middletons always have people over, and it is decorated like that, like to show that they have people over often. It's definitely him inviting all the people over. It's not her. If it was up to her, nobody would probably be coming over. Sir John Middleton really likes having people over. He particularly likes having young people over. He is like that parent that's like, you want to smoke and drink? You can do it as long as you do it in my house. He likes to have, I think he likes to sort of, I don't know, he's almost like Emma in a way from Jane Austen's Emma, where, I mean, he's not like he's not like a hardcore matchmaker, but he's sort of like, he is meddlesome, like I said. Barton Park is where they meet this woman, Mrs. Jennings. Anyway. Let me rephrase that, clarify. So at their first visit, the Dashwood women to Barton Park, they meet Mrs. Jennings, who is Lady Middleton's mother and Sir John's mother-in-law. This woman is a hoot. The two of them are partners in crime. They really, I don't know. They have a lot of fun together. I mean, it's a good thing that they get along, right? Because that's his mother-in-law, so they get along well. Mrs. Jennings is also kind of vulgar for this time period. She's not cursing like a sailor and drinking and getting drunk and stuff, but she's just sort of like, it'll come up later in the video, but she is, like I said earlier in the beginning, she's kind of like a holdover from the 18th century where they were a little bit freer than these kind of youngins in the early 19th century. There is an article that I can link in the description that talks about this really well. And this is where I got this idea. This is where I learned about this from. The Regency era was far away from the Victorian era, but like it was getting into that kind of mindset and idea of like the woman being in the house, the woman being the caregiver. Not like women weren't like that prior to the Victorian era, like not like that wasn't the expected role, but the 18th century, I mean, the 18th century is a very large period, obviously, but towards like the middle to the last half, like when you get like the American Revolution, and you had the French Revolution, and you had the Haitian Revolution, it was a lot of not just like free thinking, but I don't know, people were being rebellious and having like these new ideas about like religion and science. You know, there was what's her name, Mary Wollstonecraft, was that her name? Mary Shelley's mother, like she wrote an entire like treatise, is that what I would call it, about the rights of women. It was just like a time period of like a lot of, I don't know, I'm not explaining this very well, kind of radical ideas. I don't know where I heard this from or read this, but I'm pretty sure it's probably true. But like people from the Victorian era, they would look at portraits of like their moms and stuff, in the Regency era and be like, oh my God, so scandalous. Like, the cleavage, because, Victorian era, like, they had it buttoned up, their bodices. And the Victorian era is just known for being a little bit more, not a little bit, quite conservative. That was my little rant, my side rant. But basically, Mrs. Jennings is sort of that freer, an expression of that freer 18th century, late 18th century time. Lady Middleton, her daughter, is more reflective of the more conservative Regency values. He likes making matches. So does she. Both of her daughters, Lady Middleton, and she will come up later, but Mrs. Palmer is also her daughter. That's her youngest child. They're both married. That's disappointing for her. I mean, she's happy, obviously, but she needs more people to get hitched. She would like to make a match for Eleanor and Marion, and luckily for Mrs. Jennings, Colonel Brandon comes by Barton Park, and I have Alan Rickman, obviously a wonderful actor, seemed like a really great man. I think he's fine in the role. It's the same thing with Sir John Middleton. It's like they cast Colonel Brandon. Colonel Brandon's supposed to be like 35. And I feel like they cast him. I think there's only 2 Sense and Sensibility adaptations. I think. There's probably more, I'm sure. I don't know. It's just they cast him older. Like they've cast him a little older than what he's supposed to really be. But basically when he arrives at Barton Park, his description is that he's not like ugly, but he's not particularly, like, it says he was not unpleasing. He's not like a stud muffin. I'm not talking about Alan Rickman. I'm talking about Colonel Brandon, the character. He's not supposed to be a stud muffin, but he's reasonably attractive. But to Marion, who was 17, and Margaret, who was like, I don't even know, 12 maybe. I'm just guessing. But they think he's like an old man. Whatever hope she has of at least getting these two together, that's not gonna happen. But regardless of how he looks, whatever, Colonel Brandon is a gentleman. They all sit down for dinner. The Dashwood family, Colonel Brandon, these two, and Mrs. Jennings. They all sit down and have dinner at Barton Park. After dinner, Marion is asked to play music. She sings and plays music, like, really well. No one's really, like, paying much attention. Like, they're chit-chatting, whatever. But you know who is paying attention? Yeah, he's, like, really paying attention. Chapter 8. Somebody noticed how much Colonel Brandon was paying attention to Marion, and that was Mrs. Jennings. So now she is convinced that Colonel Brandon is in love with Marion. God save Marion Dashwood from Mrs. Jennings. So she is determined now to get these two together, and Marion is appalled because, again, she thinks that Colonel Brandon is like an old man. Like, she literally, like, when she talks about him like he's old and decrepit. He talked about like having pain. They called it like rheumatism or something, but she's saying that he's old. He's got joint pain. She says that he wears like a flannel waistcoat, which I guess is indication of like a much older man. She's not charmed by him at all. They, like, the Dashwood women are somewhere outside, I don't know. So they were talking about Colonel Brandon. Eleanor leaves wherever they were, and it's Marion and Mrs. Dashwood together, I think. And Marion brings up Edward. And she supposes that Edward is ill because, remember, Edward has an open invitation to the cottage, but he has not come by at all. So she supposes that Edward has fallen ill. But they've only been at the cottage for like 2 weeks now. So I'm like, girl, maybe he's busy. Her conclusion is that, he should have been there, already. But remember, Marion is also, she expects like the most. She expected Edward to be there like the day after they got there, like on horseback or something, with roses and chocolate. It's only been 2 weeks, so Mrs. Dashwood is like, it's fine. She's sure it's fine. But Marion Miss Drama Queen. She doesn't get it. She doesn't get why it's been 2 weeks that they have not seen each other. She doesn't understand why Eleanor is not absolutely beside herself after 2 weeks, because she would do it. And she does do it. And we'll see it later. I honestly, she's something else. Like, Marian is something else, but I do like her a lot. Okay, so chapter 9. Marian and Margaret are walking around like Barton Valley. It was nice weather up until randomly it just decides to start pouring, and they're like rushing. I can't remember who, like Marian hurts herself at some point, like she hops over something or whatever, and she like slides and like hurts her ankle. Marian hurts herself and somebody comes to her rescue. Obviously little Margaret can't carry her big sister, so somebody comes who is capable of doing that. And who comes to our damsel in distress's rescue? Him, Willoughby. At this point though, we don't get a name. It's just Willoughby. You know what? Actually, I'm gonna do this. Actually, that doesn't even work because I've had this up the whole time. I'm so stupid. Okay, let's just pretend I didn't do that. Willoughby was out hunting, and so that's how he came across the two of them. And he picks up Marian and carries her. I don't know how far, but he carries her all the way back to the cottage. He's very, very handsome, which, yeah. The person that they got to play Willoughby in the BBC series, he was fine, but yeah, this is exactly like, if I'm gonna act a fool, like if I'm gonna imagine somebody acting a fool over a man, make him look like this, because I would act a fool too. Willoughby is strong, like he's active, he's out hunting, he's strong, he's carrying Marian all the way back to the cottage in the rain. And it's also like she's literally swept off her feet. Like, it's a very like romantic, grand display. And he's not only, obviously Marian is like taken by him, but he's charming to like everybody. Mrs. Dashwood is charmed by him like immediately. He walks into the house and it's like, ooh, how are you? But so he deposits Marian at home and basically says that he's going to check up on her like the next day, make sure she's okay. Next day, after Marian was hurt, brought back to the cottage, whatever, Sir John comes to the house for, I don't think any particular reason. I think he's just there. It's his land, so I mean, I guess he's allowed to do that and just like come and whatever. I would turn off the lights. I would shut the curtains and pretend I wasn't home, but I guess it doesn't work like that for back then. Yeah, he just shows up and he learns that Willoughby is in town, and he basically puts in a good word for Willoughby and says that he's like a really nice guy and like he's lively. He says Sir John held a Christmas party that Willoughby attended, and he was up like from 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. dancing. And that's all what Marian is about. She wants a lively man with passion and spirit. Not only is he handsome, and like athletic and stuff, but now she's learning that he's like the life of the party. It's all she wants. Chapter 10. Willoughby said that he was going to call on Marian and make sure she's okay. He holds true to his word, and the two of them are talking, and they learn that they have a lot in common. They can both quote like the same poets, the same books. They love music. They love dancing. Mrs. Dashwood also really likes him. Like, it just seems perfect. Like, it's great. Marian is already like actively falling in love, and Eleanor kind of pokes fun at the two of them. It kind of basically says that they're falling in love based on shallow things and reasons. Like, they're not talking about things. Like, they're not talking about things of value. They're just like quoting Shakespeare to each other and stuff. Nonetheless, despite this, they are moving forward in their acquaintance with each other, and Mrs. Dashwood is expecting a marriage anytime soon. Colonel Brandon is around while the two of them are flirting. I don't mean around, like literally around. I just mean like they're getting on. And it's like apparent somehow, at least to Eleanor, and obviously to her, but at least to Eleanor, that Colonel Brandon likes Marion, but he's much older, at least 10 years older, and not as attractive as Willoughby. He doesn't have the qualities that Marion is looking for in particular. So he's competing with, like, he's got a lot of competition. And I think kind of not really trying that hard because he doesn't see, this is just like my theory, he doesn't see where he would succeed. So I think he's kind of already like, I've lost. One day, like one afternoon or evening or whatever, because Willoughby is at the cottage quite a bit, like often. And so the Dashwoods and Willoughby, they're sitting around, and Colonel Brandon is mentioned, and Willoughby like basically badmouths him. "Brandon is just the kind of man," said Willoughby one day when they were talking of him together, "whom everybody speaks well of and nobody cares about, whom all are delighted to see and nobody remembers to talk to." Eleanor basically talks about how she likes Colonel Brandon. And Willoughby's like, well, if you like him, then, you know, I guess he's a good guy. Like, that certainly makes him seem good because he likes Eleanor, right? Eleanor is the sister to the woman that he's kind of technically courting. Willoughby doesn't like Colonel Brandon. We don't really know exactly why. He does kind of give a reason, but we don't see Colonel Brandon acting in any particular way for anyone to really dislike him. So it's basically just his word, and like we have to assume like, okay, like maybe he's not a good guy, but he's literally never shown to not be. Chapter 11, the Dashwoods are booked and busy. Sir John Middleton is like constantly inviting them to things, inviting them to Barton Park, people coming over to their house and stuff. Along with the Dashwoods, Willoughby is also invited to these events. And at these events, Willoughby and Marion, they're always together. When there's dancing, they only dance with each other. When they have to separate for whatever reason, they don't want to dance with anybody else except each other. And it basically makes them sort of like, people poke fun at them. It makes them easy targets for people to just laugh at for kind of like how ridiculous they're being. Because basically, again, not a Regency era expert, but from my understanding is that if you are not like seriously courting and making it known that you're going to be married soon, you know, you want to diversify like who you're dancing with and who you're talking to and stuff. So it kind of seems like they're courting, but there hasn't really been like any moves towards that like next step. Eleanor does not approve of their behavior. Marion doesn't care. She's like, can't stop, won't stop. Even though Eleanor doesn't like this, Mrs. Dashwood is fine. And again, I'll link the article. But, you know, we have this disparity between this mother and this daughter, and then again with this mother and this daughter. And this mother would have grown up in the 1800s and lived most of their lives so far. More so her. Mrs. Dashwood is also like probably around her 40s. But they have more like 18th century values. And their daughters they have more 19th century values. So Mrs. Dashwood is like, they're young and in love. Like, let them, it's kind of like that libertine sort of free love kind of vibe. And Eleanor's like, no, it's not acceptable. But, so, while Marion is flaunting her affection with Willoughby, Eleanor is kind of suffering in silence, even though she seems like she's okay about Edward, even though their relationship was sort of not super defined and confirmed. She does miss him. She misses Edward, and also there's nobody like at these dances and stuff who interests her enough to distract her from how much she misses him. But so even though Eleanor does not really like a lot of the company, like she doesn't even really get along with like Lady Middleton that much. Mrs. Jennings is a nice lady, but she could be a lot. Hi, I am so sorry. So my mic fell and then just like it fell out of the laptop, off the cord. So I plugged it back in to record the rest of the video, and the audio is just so weird. Thankfully, my camera does have a built-in mic. It's not the best, but it's something, so I apologize. It's really frustrating actually, because I had a lot of fun making this video, and it's just kind of disappointing that there was a mishap and I didn't even realize. Eleanor, she likes Colonel Brandon. I think he's like the only person she really has like a really good relationship with. She likes him. He's a nice guy. The two of them are also both suffering in silence. Eleanor misses Edward, and Colonel Brandon he's in love with Marion. But he's basically just watching her fall in love with somebody else and can't do anything about it, and he doesn't really try to do anything about it. He respects her space and respects her boundaries, and you gotta respect that. Chapter 12, Willoughby. He gives Marion a horse. Marion tells Eleanor, and she's like, no, he did not. She didn't say that, but that's basically what she said. And she's like, you're gonna give back the horse. You're not taking the horse. They don't have the means or the resources to have a horse. They don't have somebody that can take care of it. They don't even have the space. So yeah, Marion gives back the gift of the horse. Now, Margaret, remember Margaret? Yeah, she doesn't come up a lot, but I do when I'm referencing all of them when I talk about the Dashwoods, because obviously she's a little girl, so majority of the time, like where at least Mrs. Dashwood is, Margaret is. But yeah, so Margaret is convinced that Marion and Willoughby are going to get married because Margaret saw Willoughby take a lock of Marion's hair, and back in the day, that was like, I think you could even do that with like your sister or your mom. But with two people who seem to be courting each other, that was a romantic gesture. It's seeming like they're like good to go. They're falling in love. They're exchanging pieces of hair. They're only dancing with each other. They're exchanging Shakespeare quotes. Match made in heaven. I'm gonna read my notes because this is a lot. So basically, chapter 13, Eleanor and Sir John, Mrs. Jennings, Marion, I think Margaret is there. They're basically all planning to go to Whitewell, and Whitewell is an estate in Devonshire. It's near Barton Park. Every summer, Sir John, he takes people to this estate, to Whitewell, and it is Colonel Brandon's brother-in-law's estate, but the brother-in-law and his sister are in Switzerland or something, or France, Avignon, whatever. His brother-in-law is not currently at Whitewell, so while they're not there, Colonel Brandon is basically its overseer, and Sir John is allowed to take people to it, but Colonel Brandon has to be there. So they're all planning, Sir John, Mrs. Jennings, Marion, Margaret, Eleanor. They're gonna go to Whitewell, but Colonel Brandon is immediately like met with, somebody delivers a letter, and he's like, I gotta go. And so their trip to Whitewell is canceled, and everybody's disappointed. Colonel Brandon leaves, and Mrs. Jennings blurts out like, I think I know why he left. And everybody, like even Eleanor, everybody, they're like, give us the tea, girl. So here we go. So Eliza Williams is a relation, according to Mrs. Jennings, Eliza Williams is a relation of Colonel Brandon She claims that Eliza is Colonel Brandon's natural daughter. That is quite a salacious claim to make because Colonel Brandon has never, as far as we know, been married. So it would have had to been a child out of wedlock. So yeah, that's who Mrs. Jennings claims summoned him. That's who she claims that's who she claims Eliza is Colonel Brandon's natural daughter. So she's saying that he was whisked away to attend to her. And that's about all the information we get so far. In chapter 13, Sir John returns from somewhere. I honestly don't know where he went. But he comes from somewhere and says, well, you know, we can't go to Whitewell, but we like have the carriages out and stuff. We can at least take a drive around the country. So that is what they do. The carriages come, and Willoughby and Marian, of course, they go in a carriage together on their own. And Willoughby, the minute they get in the carriages, they take off. He's driving it, he takes off, and they disappear for like a really long time. And when they come back, Sir John's like, I know where you went, I know something you don't. That's basically what he's saying. He's like, I know where you went. And it's not even like a point the finger. It's like with like a grin, like a wink, like, I know where you went. Marian is like blushing, like, what do you know where we went? What do you mean? Willoughby lives with his aunt. I think her name is like Mrs. Smith or something. So he took her to see his house when Mrs. Smith was there, but I don't think Mrs. Smith knows that they were there, and like they were just basically in this house on their own. And you know, Eleanor's like, you were together alone, like what? So I looked on Reddit, the Jane Austen subreddit, and there was like a little bit of a discussion on whether or not they participated in sexy times, like whether or not they had sex. I think that's up for a good thing that could be up for debate. It is, okay, somebody said that Marian is such a dramatic person and it's really hard for her to hide things, that if they had had sex, it would have been obvious. But, I mean, she's blushing super hard. Maybe they could have just kissed. Who knows? Nobody knows. They were just gone for a really long time. Literally nobody knows what happens except the two of them. I do think at the very least they probably kissed. I think that's very likely to have happened. I kind of doubt that they would have had sex. Like, it is something that some people think and bring up, but I doubt it. But I think at least like something happened that wasn't super appropriate for this like time period. You know, obviously I am very sex positive. You do you, as long as it's safe and consensual. You know, you do you, boo. I really do not care. But for this time period, disappearing for hours, unchaperoned, and doing God knows what, single, like unmarried, it just wasn't particularly appropriate. Him showing her his house is like further sign that he's preparing to propose marriage to her. Chapter 14 happens. Not a lot happens. Mrs. Jennings won't shut up about not being able to go to Whitewell. The Dashwoods, they're back in the cottage, and Willoughby is also there per usual, and he goes on and on about like how great the cottage is and stuff, because Mrs. Dashwood is talking about like making improvements, like we want to make improvements to the house. Willoughby's like, don't you dare. Willoughby promises to call at 4. I think it was 4? Yes. 4 o'clock. Chapter 15 comes. Eleanor and Mrs. Dashwood go to visit with Lady Middleton at Barton Park. Willoughby and Marian have their little meeting. He has to go to London. He's being sent to London by his aunt, Mrs. Smith, and obviously this has absolutely devastated Marian. Chapter 16, Willoughby is now gone. He is in London, and he has not written to Marian. Early 19th century ghosting. And so Marian is like, you know, kind of like she's looking out for him, and a man on horseback is seen riding up to the cottage, and it is assumed that it is Willoughby, but it is not. It is. It's Edward. Edward is here now at the cottage. It comes out that Edward has been in Devonshire for about 2 weeks, and it's noted by, I think, Marion, that that's kind of strange that he's been in Devonshire for 2 weeks and has not called upon Eleanor like at all. Chapter 17, really quick, but basically Edward, everybody just kind of notices that he seems a little off. So chapter 18, Eleanor in particular, she notices not only does Edward seem off, but he seems unhappy. And her observation extends into the next. Edward stays like the night. I'm not sure if it's a couple of nights or just the night, but he stays over at the cottage, and Eleanor notices that even into the next morning, like he just seems really kind of like miserable. So what's really interesting about chapter 18 is that Edward is noticed wearing a ring of hair. Now, I've already mentioned, like, Margaret thought that Willoughby had taken a lock of Marion's hair, and she was like, they're getting married. So it's a big deal. And Eleanor, when she notices the lock of hair on Edward's finger, she assumes it's hers. She assumes that he somehow got a piece of her hair and made a ring out of it. I don't know why she would think that, honestly. And for some reason, she assumes that he had somehow acquired a lock of her hair secretly, and is, I'm just knocking this, but she thinks that he's just wearing her hair. But either way, him secretly acquiring a piece of her hair to wear it does not bother her. And when it's noticed that he's wearing it, Edward seems a little bit embarrassed by it. So, obviously there's something up with this lock of hair. Chapter 19, Edward stays for a week at the cottage. After staying a week at the cottage, Edward seems to perk up quite a bit, and I think he then leaves. So Edward leaves. At some point, Eleanor is sitting down to draw. While sitting in the front room, she notices people are coming up to the cottage from the window. Like, she can see them from the window. It's Sir John Middleton, Lady Middleton, Mrs. Jennings? Yes. Okay. Here we go. Sir John Middleton, Lady Middleton, Mrs. Jennings, and then 2 people she doesn't know. These 2. So Mrs. Jennings, youngest daughter, and her husband. So they come up to the cottage, and like literally the window that Eleanor is sitting at to draw is right next to the front door. And John comes up to it, Sir John, and he's like, so what do you think about these 2 people? Huh? They're right next to the window. And Eleanor's like, I don't think it's really appropriate to talk about these 2 people when they can hear me. Mrs. Palmer is like the nicest lady. Her husband doesn't seem like he wants to exist. And I don't mean like he seems depressed. I think he just like doesn't want to be there ever. So, but what I find interesting is that like these 2 seem like they would have been the better couple because they're quite similar. And then these 2 are like aloof. It's almost like they married like the opposites. Opposites attract. Mrs. Jennings, as we know, this woman likes to talk. And she blabs and blabs. To some point, she reveals basically that Mrs. Palmer is pregnant, but it's not said. Like, that word is never said. There's never mentioned of a belly in no Austen novel. Will you hear the word pregnant unless it's used for something else? I don't think so. I don't think the word pregnant, period, does not appear in an Austen novel, even though there are pregnant characters. There's no mention of like a belly, nothing. We just know, we can assume that Mrs. Palmer is pregnant because Mrs. Jennings says that she would have preferred them to not travel so far, like for her health. And she also says that Mrs. Palmer is going to be preparing for like her confined. She says she's going to be confined in February. It's a confinement like women in the Regency time, like at a certain point, they were just confined to the house, I suppose, while they were pregnant. That sounds miserable. So as much as Lady Middleton loves children and loves her own children, well, she loves her children. I don't know about children in general, but so as much as she loves her children, she does not appreciate her mother talking about her sister's pregnancy. And again, I'll keep, as much as I talk about it, I will make sure to keep referencing it so you can look at it, whoever's watching. Pregnancy is just, like I said, it's not something that you'll see mentioned in Austen's novel. And then for this time period, you know, like women were at some point like confined, like it's just strange to me that obviously it's a different time period, so there's a lot of things that are strange to me. Like, they're all adults, they know how babies are made, and there's so much focus on like getting married, like in this time period, like getting married and having children, like having families, having heirs, but like we can't openly talk about pregnancy. Anyway, so, but it's kind of like a vulgar thing that she's just like openly commenting on her being pregnant, and Lady Middleton doesn't like it. I'm almost done. My throat is like... So chapter 20, there's not much left, so I'm just gonna read. So the next day after meeting Mrs. Palmer, she visits the Dashwoods again, like she stops by the cottage, and she invites Eleanor and Marian to come with her and her husband to London, and the sisters decline, and the Eleanor and Marian continue to chat with Mrs. Palmer, and Mr. Palmer is an ass the entire time. Mrs. Palmer then invites the girls again to visit their house, their estate. It's called Cleveland, around Christmas, and the Dashwood sisters decline again. Willoughby is brought up, and Eleanor asks Mrs. Palmer about him. Colonel Brandon is then brought up. So at one point, Colonel Brandon and Mrs. Palmer had a thing, I suppose. But Mrs. Palmer says she's happy with Mr. Palmer. Can't imagine why. So chapter 21, like I said, the Palmer's estate is called Cleveland, and they go back to that. Eleanor and Marian, they take a trip to Exeter, which is a city, and this is where they meet two young women who are related to Mrs. Jennings. So discovering that these two women are related to Mrs. Jennings, Sir John invites them to Barton Park. Who are these two women? Lucy Steele and Anne Steele. Somehow are related to Mrs. Jennings. Literally don't know how these people are related, don't know how he is related to them. I don't know, but they're related somehow. But the two Steele sisters win Lady Middleton over immediately, because like I said, if you like her children, she will like you. Her children are bad and spoiled, and Eleanor and Marian are not fake about it. They don't particularly care for them, but they're not like rude either. They just don't like them very much. But the Steele sisters they dote on the kids, they talk to the kids, they play with them, and Lady Middleton loves that. She eats that shit up. It's almost like the Steele sisters are kind of like the foils for the Dashwood sisters. They are like pretty, but not as pretty as Eleanor and Marian. They dress well, but not as well. Well, I don't know if dressing is like a big deal for the Dashwood sisters, but basically like whatever they are, Eleanor and Marian are just better. In general, the Dashwood sisters, like this is my opinion, are just more authentic than the Steele sisters. The Steele sisters are very affected. And even though Marian is very dramatic, at least she's just honest. Feels everything with her whole heart. And even if it's a little ridiculous at times, at least it is honest. All right, I'm almost done, so I'm getting tired. So Willoughby is brought up again because everyone is convinced that he and Marian are engaged. So they're like, yeah, congrats, good for you. And then Sir John jokingly brings up Edward, but in a sly way, by just referring to Edward by his last name, which starts with an F. But eventually he gives the name away. And Lucy's like, so Lucy's reaction to Edward being mentioned, it intrigues Eleanor because it's clear that they know each other somehow. Like, this is why y'all need to leave your little circle, because like, why do these two know each other? Like, how do these people know each other? Like, you know, like, leave the circle. So chapter 22, we find out the big secret. So these two are actually engaged. Yeah. So Edward, he was like the like apprentice, sort of, to Lucy's uncle. And while working with her uncle, they fell in love. He was much younger then, and they fell in love and they got engaged. So that ring of hair, it was Lucy's. Obviously, Lucy tells this to Eleanor, and Eleanor is shocked. Edward never ever mentioned Lucy, and Lucy's like, yeah, we did that on purpose. It was supposed to be a secret. Basically, like I said earlier in the video, Mrs. Ferrars is in control of Edward's assets. Lucy does not have much, period, and wants Edward to marry a rich woman. What? I'm coming. Just wait a little bit. Can you wait a little bit? Can you sit down? Sit. I'm coming. Give me a couple minutes. I'm coming. So yeah, she wants Edward to marry a rich woman. Lucy is not a rich woman. And if she finds out that the two of them are engaged, she'll cut him off. So that's that. So that is volume 1. That's all volume 1. And I'm tired. My elbow hurts from holding my microphone and my voice is messed up. I'm ready to go to bed. This is my first attempt at something like this. I hope I did a decent job to whoever is watching, and I hope you really enjoyed this. I will do part 2. I really hope soon, like soon enough. I will do my best. I do have stuff coming up, like I said, my research paper. I got worky things that I be doing, you know, but I will work on the second part. If anyone's interested, honestly, it doesn't really even matter to me if anyone was interested watching this, because I had fun doing this. It was a little awkward for me at first. Honestly, it felt like I was doing a presentation, but the more like I got into it, it was fun. I get why people do this. I guess I'll be keeping these up because, yeah, I just keep them up for now and they can watch me while I sleep. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And that's it. And ready to go. I'm ready to go to bed.